Hey everyone, and welcome back to Royalty Now. Today we're talking about the brilliant yet controversial military leader Napoleon Bonaparte. We'll talk about his incredible life and the path he took to become Emperor of the French. Then of course we'll talk about what he really looked like and reveal some recreations. We also have a bonus recreation of the love of his life, Empress Josephine. And special thanks to Clio for sponsoring today's episode. Let's go ahead and get started. Napoleon Bonaparte was born on the 15th of August, 1769, in Ajaccio, Corsica. His father, Carlo Bonaparte, was descended from a noble Tuscan family that had moved to Corsica in the 16th century. His mother, Letizia, was Genovese nobility, and although she was the main disciplinary force in Napoleon's life, their relationship was incredibly close. The year before Napoleon was born, France conquered the island of Corsica after 14 years of its independence. Both Carlo and Letizia had fought in the guerrilla movement against the French, even while Letizia was pregnant with Napoleon. But after Corsica fell to the French, his father, facing exile and the ruin of his family, chose to acknowledge French rule in Corsica, betraying his countrymen but securing his family's future. This decision alone completely changed the course of Napoleon's life, allowing him to become the man we all know today. From a very early age, Napoleon was fascinated with the military. The French presence in Corsica offered the young Napoleon the chance to see them march and patrol every day. He would mimic the soldiers, and at one point he even went as far as eating only stale bread as a child, just to get used to it, as he would one day be a soldier. By the time Napoleon was 9 years old, his father had gained favor with the French government. He was invited to become the Corsican representative in the court of Louis XVI. As a prize for his early loyalty, Carlo was given royal scholarships for his children to France's military academy. Napoleon would be granted his greatest wish and begin his career as a soldier. In 1779, a 10-year-old Napoleon moved alone from his home in Corsica to attend the academy in France. His new home was very different to what he had imagined. Like many Corsican children, Napoleon was brought up to speak and read in Corsican and Italian. He soon realized that he had foreign mannerisms, a foreign name that no one could pronounce, and an inability to speak French that would make life very difficult. His new high society classmates bullied him from the outset, and although he would eventually learn to speak fluently, his distinct Corsican accent never left him. These years of bullying would lead young Napoleon to become serious, somber, and a bit awkward. He would spend hours by himself, throwing himself into books in the library and moving quickly from topic to topic. Eventually, he found himself reading about the great men of history: Hannibal, Alexander the Great, and Julius Caesar. I think it was here that Napoleon first began to think of who he could become. What made these great men so different from him? On a snowy morning in 1783, the boys at the military academy began a huge snowball fight. They split into two forces. Napoleon, now 14 years old, took the lead of one of the groups, and he took it very seriously. He began to quickly yell out orders to his classmates, flanking and outmaneuvering them, finally putting the hours poring over strategy books to good use. His side crushed the other boys, and for the first time, his classmates no longer saw him as just the boy from Corsica. They saw him as a leader. He would graduate from Brienne-le-Château in 1785 and was quickly admitted to become an artillery officer in Paris. Sadly, only a few months after he began, his father Carlo Bonaparte suddenly died of stomach cancer. Although Napoleon wasn't the eldest son, he immediately assumed the position as head of the Bonaparte family, and his priorities shifted. No longer having the time or funding to finish his remaining 2 years of academy, he would study relentlessly for the next 7 months, knowing that his family needed the officer pay. Though it usually took 3 years, Napoleon was able to pass his entrance exam, and he became an officer in the French military at only 16 years old. Unfortunately for Napoleon, it would turn out that military life was nothing like he had dreamt of. Over the next few years, he would find himself stuck in the politics of it all. He quickly realized that his dreams of rising through the ranks would never come true. There was always a man with ancient nobility cutting him in line. He began to lose his passion for it all. Was he really destined to live a life of mediocrity? Fortunately for Napoleon, the French Revolution began, and everything changed. Napoleon quickly became an adamant supporter of the revolution. He wanted nothing more than to be able to prove his talent and be rewarded for it. This was his chance at the life he knew he deserved. However, after the executions of the King and Queen, Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, tensions in the rest of Europe began to rise. The kings of Europe began to see the revolution as a massive threat to their own rule. Would their own people also be inspired to rise up and overthrow them? If this could happen in France, it could happen to them. And that was extremely dangerous. Several countries united against France in 1792, calling themselves the First Coalition. The country was surrounded, and with the coalition's support, civil war broke out in France. The new French Republic called on young men all over the country to lead its new army in defense of the revolution. Starting in 1793, Napoleon began his meteoric rise through the ranks of the French Republic's military. He joined a Corsican military unit and he was promoted to artillery commander even before his first battle. He distinguished himself first at the siege of Toulon. French royalists had taken the city, supported by British and Spanish ships in the harbor. After many failed attempts by the army to take the city back, they needed a new plan. The freshly promoted Napoleon knew exactly what needed to be done. He quickly ordered his men and artillery to take control of a fort on the other side of the harbor. Once there, they positioned themselves at the top of a hill and shelled the enemy ships, forcing their evacuation. Without Spanish and British support, the city was taken back from the Royalists in 2 days, and Napoleon was given credit for his first successful battle. It was obvious to his superiors that Napoleon was something special. He was quickly promoted to colonel, and just a week later he was promoted to brigadier general, all before the age of 24. After the quelling of a massive royalist rebellion in Paris, Napoleon was again promoted. This time he was given command of an entire army, the Army of Italy. Napoleon was already being seen as a hero of France. He had begun to garner fame, wealth, and glory. But he soon realized that he was still missing one huge piece: love. In 1795, Napoleon met a woman named Josephine, and he was immediately enamored with her. But it was said that Josephine was not quite as taken with Napoleon. Known by her birth name Rose up until her relationship with him, Josephine was 6 years his elder, and she had previously been married with 2 children. She also didn't have the best reputation. It was common knowledge that she had been with several well-known political figures just recently. But Napoleon didn't care. It wasn't long before Napoleon proposed, and they were married just a year later in 1796. Now, Napoleon's family wasn't quite as thrilled as he was about the marriage. They viewed Josephine as a social climber that would break his heart, and they weren't exactly wrong. Just 2 days after their marriage, Napoleon was called away to command his army of Italy. But when Napoleon arrived, he discovered that his troops were underfed, undisciplined, and unmotivated. But he took it as a challenge. He would dismiss soldiers and even entire regiments if they didn't hold up to his standard. His unending belief in himself seemed to inspire them to fight. 2 weeks after beginning his campaign, his army of Italy had defeated the Kingdom of Sardinia, and Napoleon's career of domination began. The loyalty he earned from his soldiers did not come only from words. He was known to be very physical, literally in the trenches with his soldiers, pointing and firing cannons himself, and yelling out orders at the top of his lungs. According to author David Chandler, he could rapidly dictate complex commands, keeping in mind where major units were expected to be at each future point, and like a chess master, seeing the best play moves ahead. Over the next year on his campaign, he would write to his wife Josephine. His letters are beautiful and very famous. He constantly expresses his pain and stress commanding the army in Italy, writing often and expressing his desire to be near her. In one letter he writes, "Since I left you, I have been constantly depressed. My happiness is to be near you. Incessantly, I live over in my memory your caresses, your tears, your affectionate solicitude. The charms of the incomparable Josephine kindle continually a burning and glowing flame in my heart. However, her indifference can be seen when he begs, I write to you, my beloved one, very often, and you write very little. Unfortunately, Napoleon's happiness would not last long. Back in Paris, Josephine had begun a secret affair with a man named Hippolyte. A letter detailing Josephine's affair reached Napoleon, and his heart was completely shattered. But despite his sadness, and maybe because of it, his army was dominating. By October of 1797, Napoleon defeated Austria and ended Europe's war on France. He would come back to Paris seen as a hero. His popularity amongst the people grew quickly, and his political influence and ambition during this time grew even faster. During his campaign, he wrote new constitutions for republics that he had defeated. He began 2 newspapers, one for the troops and one for the people in France. On top of being a master military strategist, he also had become a master of propaganda. Although his next campaign in Egypt would be a failure, losing thousands of men to disease and British defeat, his newspapers back in France were able to minimize anything that went wrong, only reporting back that Napoleon had found something called the Rosetta Stone. In late 1799, Napoleon would return to Paris, and with the help of influential politicians and his younger brother Lucien, he overthrew the unpopular government known as the Directory. A brand new constitution was created, and Napoleon was named first consul for the next 10 years. Now this effectively made him a dictator, but he would go ahead and take it a step further when he made himself consul for life only a few years later. Although he's best known to us today as a military leader, Napoleon did introduce some very effective social reforms that we still use today. He went after corrupt politicians and improved higher education, infrastructure, and banking. He is famous for what we now call the Napoleonic Code, a set of civil laws that he developed with several leading political experts. These laws forbade privileges based on birth, and they allowed citizens to practice religion freely. They also stated that government jobs must be given based on merit, and not based on birthright. Unfortunately, Napoleon decided to also roll back some of the privileges of female citizens, effectively handing women's rights back to their husbands. Just one of the stains on his legacy. Nevertheless, Napoleon was very popular with the French people because his rule brought stability to France for the first time since the breakout of the Revolution. And he loved perpetuating the message that the revolution was over all thanks to him. In 1804, after a somewhat suspicious 99% popular vote in his favor, the French Senate proclaimed Napoleon Bonaparte the Emperor of the French. He was crowned on the 2nd of December 1804 in Notre Dame. In front of the Pope himself, Napoleon placed the crown on his own head, and then bent to place the crown of Empress on Josephine. Now, Napoleon was very careful about what he called himself. He chose the term emperor and not king as a way to demonstrate that he was not attempting to restore the monarchy, but instead introduce a new political system entirely. However, many view this in hindsight as a treacherous power grab, basically restoring another absolute ruler under a different name in place of the one that the revolution had just worked so hard to overthrow. But now Napoleon, the bullied boy from Corsica, is now the Emperor of the French in one of the most astonishing rises to power in history. But even this wasn't enough. To satisfy Napoleon's ambition, he wanted all of Europe. From 1805 through 1809, Napoleon sets off on his conquest and begins his domination. Austria's repeated defeats to Napoleon cause it to dissolve the Holy Roman Empire, the 1,000-year-old empire created by Charlemagne. Its official end was on August 6, 1806. Prussia was defeated shortly after, and Napoleon's biggest threat, Russia, joined them in defeat in 1807. By 1809, Napoleon had defeated the alliances of European powers 5 separate times. He is already arguably the greatest military commander of all time. His alliance with Russia brings peace to Europe. He has also placed his brothers as rulers all over Europe. The Bonaparte dynasty is now fully realized, except for one small thing. Napoleon himself does not have an heir. Josephine's affair all those years ago had changed their marriage. The loving Napoleon had become cold to her, starting countless affairs of his own. Fearing divorce, Josephine became useful to Napoleon. She caused no more scandals and began to work constantly for Napoleon's public image and political connections. He began to trust her again, and soon enough, his love for her was rekindled. But sadly, after many years of marriage, it appeared that Josephine was no longer able to bear children, and Napoleon would need an heir in order to continue his legacy. He tells Josephine that in the best interest of the empire, he must find a new wife. Josephine agreed, and their annulment took place in 1810. His next marriage would be a political alliance. Napoleon married the young Marie-Louise of Austria. Their child was born in 1811, and Napoleon had his heir. Despite their separation, Napoleon insisted that Josephine keep the title and rank of Empress. It is my will that she retain the rank and title of Empress, and especially that she never doubt my sentiments, and that she ever hold me as her best and dearest friend. In 1812, Russia broke its treaty with France by trading with England, and Napoleon used this to declare war against them. He gathered the largest army that Europe has ever seen, 612,000 men, and he began his march to Russia. It would mark the beginning of the end. Russia would try a new tactic on Napoleon: scorched earth. They would run from his army, burning everything they could while doing so, and leaving nothing for Napoleon's enormous army to live off of. Brutal heat, low supplies, and disease would begin to kill Napoleon's men by the thousands. Yet still, Napoleon's need for more, his want to be the greatest, his need for it kept him moving forward when he should have turned back. Before he had even reached Moscow, he had lost 500,000 men to desertion and disease. 500,000 lives. The battle for Moscow took 30,000 more. As the Russians once again flee, they burn Moscow behind them. In his mind, Napoleon had defeated Russia and was waiting for the Russians to sue for peace. But a month passed and he had received nothing. As he watched over the ruins of the city, the first snow of winter fell, and Napoleon realized that he had made a terrible mistake. Napoleon and his army began their 500-mile escape back to safety, but the cold came more quickly than they could march. Russia began to perform this sort of hit-and-run warfare on Napoleon's army. They would capture and kill men at random. Men and horses also began to freeze to death. Napoleon even began to wear poison around his neck, fearing an imminent capture. The Russians got so close to destroying his entire army, but it's said that about 40,000 men were able to escape with their lives. After hearing of this horrible defeat, Europe again united for the 6th time against France. Only this time, it would work. The 6th coalition defeated Napoleon at the Battle of Leipzig, which only happened after Napoleon refused peace terms. The peace terms would have even let him continue on as Emperor of France, but his ego would not allow him to lose. The terms after the defeat were much harsher. France would lose all territories gained, and Napoleon was exiled to the Isle of Elba. To make matters worse, it was during this time that Napoleon learned that his Empress Josephine had suddenly died. It is said that her last months had been spent begging to join Napoleon in exile. He locked himself in his room for days. When he emerged, Napoleon decided that he would escape exile and with his faithful army, attempt to regain his empire. But he just wasn't the same. At the Battle of Waterloo, 42,000 men died for Napoleon in his final defeat. He would again be exiled, but this time to the even more remote island of St. Helena. He was guarded by 2,000 soldiers and 2 warships that constantly circled the island. He would remain on this tiny, humble island until his death on May 5th, 1821, at the age of 51. His very last words are said to have been for the love of his life. He called out for her, Josephine. The Napoleonic Wars would cause the death of an estimated 3 to 6 million people, all because of one man's insatiable and aggressive ego. Napoleon is a man of contradictions, said to have been an absolute tyrant by some, with others saying he was one of the greatest men of all time. Historian Martin Van Crevel describes him as the most competent human being who ever lived. His Napoleonic Code opened the door to opportunity for ordinary people, and it's a pillar of the basic rights that we all expect today. He is undoubtedly one of the greatest, if not the greatest military commander the world has ever seen, winning 67 out of 76 battles, a nearly 90% win rate. His love letters to Josephine were purchased by Bill Gates for $1 million and show an incredibly soft side to the man. Like all of us, he was an incredibly complex individual who lived, in my opinion, one of the most outstanding lives ever lived. Before we talk about the recreations, let's talk about today's sponsor, Clio. Named after the ancient Greek muse of history, Clio recreates the fragrances that your favorite historical figures would have encountered in their daily lives. My favorite thing about Clio is that they use actual historical sources to recreate the aromas of the past. So in a way, you can travel back in time using one of your most powerful senses. We worked with Clio recently to create a candle based on Eleanor of Aquitaine. In Eleanor's time, she would have had flowers like violets and roses in her room, and the castle she lived in would have had woven rush grass mats sprinkled with lavender and rosemary. The candle recreates Eleanor's medieval world, and it's one of my favorites to have in the house. It's a really transportive experience. Visit Clio.global to explore the latest collection, which features more than 3,000 years of olfactive history. And just for Royalty Now subscribers, Clio is offering you 15% off your first order. Use the code ROYALTYNOW at checkout. Link is in the description below. Now let's get back to our subjects. So let's talk about what Napoleon and Josephine really looked like. Now you may be thinking, well, of course we know what they both look like. There are dozens of portraits available that depict them throughout their lives. But there's this interesting repeated sentiment from Napoleon's contemporaries that portraits of him never seem to capture his true likeness. A friend of Napoleon's brother Joseph once wrote that probably no one that ever lived had so many likenesses which generally bear some resemblance of feature or form, but it was extremely difficult to portray or delineate Napoleon's look. Luckily, we do have a ton of descriptions of the emperor throughout his life. It was said that he was very thin in his youth to the point of looking almost emaciated, but that he gained weight throughout his life. Some people remarked that he always had kind of an odd haircut. The descriptions also agree that he had somewhat delicate features and piercing gray or blue eyes. And of course, although Napoleon is often mocked for being a small man, he stood around 5'7", which was an average height for the time. Shannon Sellen wrote a great summary of why it's hard to know what Napoleon really looked like. First of all, many portraits of Napoleon were made by artists who didn't have him there as a model. So their paintings were based on other works or even just a description of the man. Even in the famous image by Jacques-Louis David of Napoleon crossing the Alps, Napoleon wasn't there to model, so the artist had to revise the painting several times. As we mentioned earlier, Napoleon was a master of propaganda, and so he was very careful about which images of himself were released. His main concern was not portraying a true likeness, but rather portraying his power. For one of my recreations, I've used the bust of Napoleon by Antoine Denis Chaudet. This bust was created as the official sculpted likeness of Napoleon, so his original plaster model was recreated over 1,200 times and disseminated throughout the empire as the official likeness. And while Napoleon's valet said that this was the most faithful image he'd seen of Napoleon, I do suspect that there has been a bit of beautification, but I really like this image of him. I've also created a version based off of the famous Napoleon in his study image by Jacques-Louis David. While Napoleon himself really liked this image, The valet that said the Chaudet bust was the most accurate also said that this painting had something heavy about it that the emperor didn't have. We also have a death mask of Napoleon, which I really like, but it's clear that he wasted away from his illness at the end of his life, and his features are without a doubt much sharper and thinner here than when he would have been in good health. Josephine's appearance is almost as mysterious, with many portraits of her looking a bit different from each other. What they do share in common is a woman with delicate features, deep-set eyes with visible lids, a medium-length, sharp nose, and a small mouth with a pointed chin. The portrait that looks the most different to me is the portrait of Josephine as Empress, which might be the most famous depiction of her. And I'm not sure the reason behind this, or if it was at her own personal request, which is definitely possible, but it definitely shows a more blunt chin and just a different appearance overall. I quite like this version of her by Robert Lefebvre, painted in 1805. And for some reason, this one looks just the most real and natural to me, so that's what I've used for my depiction. So let's go ahead and take a look at the recreations of Napoleon and Josephine now. Thank you all so much for watching. Please leave a comment with your future suggestions down below, and of course check out the Etsy store for prints and bookmarks of your favorite recreations. And we'll see you all for the next video.